afternoon. So we've come finally, I know you're saying finally, the last part of this series on the book of Esther. So this is part 5. This is the end. This is the celebration. This is when actually we get to see how Mordecai and Esther rejoice in victory. So where we left off last week, we left with Haman's plan was being exposed, the king siding with Queen Esther, and finally Haman being killed. And so then we get to chapter 8. Chapter 8, the king transfers everything that belonged to Haman to Esther. And then Esther brings Mordecai into the palace and introduces him to the king. The king finds out who Mordecai actually is to Esther. And Mordecai gets Haman's ring from the king. And it seems like he's put into the same position that Haman had, right? And so as we saw some time ago, the Lord humbles the proud and the Lord exalts the humble. And we see this exchange of positions between Haman and Mordecai. So then Queen Esther pleads with the king again to overthrow the edict of Haman to destroy all the Jewish people. But the king says, look, I can't do that. But the king gives an idea to Mordecai and to Esther and says, why don't you write another edict in my name in order to protect the Jewish people? So Mordecai writes in the king's name, and he seals it with the king's ring, and it's granted to the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves on that particular day that they were supposed to be destroyed. In essence, those who still had held allegiance to Haman and would follow through with his order, they would essentially be killed and annihilated by the Jews. And so this goes back to what we saw in the second part of this series when we saw the conflict between Haman and Mordecai, which was actually a conflict between the Amalekites and Israel, or anyone that identified with the Amalekites, they would be known as Agagites, right? And so we see this age-old conflict that we see that was also portrayed in the Garden of Eden between the devil and mankind, and throughout the Bible we see this ultimately being fulfilled in Christ as he has victory over the powers of darkness. So in one sense, Queen Esther and Mordecai actually succeed where King Saul failed. If you remember when we looked at that portion, that King Saul actually failed to destroy the Amalekites and to eliminate them, but actually here we see Esther and Mordecai succeeding in where King Saul actually failed. And so we see there's joyous celebration in Susa because Haman's edict is actually being overthrown, right? And so we read that when Haman actually sent out his edict, we read that there was confusion in Susa and throughout the palace. But now when this edict of Esther and Mordecai is sent out, there's great celebration and there's great rejoicing. Then we get to chapter 9. Mordecai is increasing in power and authority in the kingdom. Many people are becoming afraid of him. And so finally, the administrators and the governors actually end up helping the Jewish people because of fear of Mordecai. So in Susa, what happens is they ended up killing about 500 people, including the 10 sons of Haman. They report this. The king reports this to Esther, and the king again another time asks Queen Esther, "Is there anything else that you want me to do?" Now Esther's pretty ruthless here, and she says, "Well, can we do this again for another day?" And so, and I want the 10 sons of Haman to be impaled. And so our sweet little Queen Esther is a pretty ruthless queen right here and asking for this. And so another 300 people died the next day. In total, in the rest of the kingdom, there's about 75,000 people that ended up being killed on that day. And on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day, it was made into a day of feasting and joy. Right? And so remember, we looked at the beginning of the series, I told you there's a lot of banquets. There's a lot of feasting going on throughout this book. And so even at the end of this book, there's another feast. There's another celebration, right? And we'll look at that in a moment, this feast of Purim. So these things are recorded, and then every year on the 14th and 15th day of the month Adar, there is a day of remembrance. There's also giving of gifts to the poor. And so they call this the Feast of Purim, and Purim means the lot. And they would establish this so that they could remember what God has done for them. And in chapter 10 concludes, a small little chapter concludes with the greatness of Mordecai and how he was second to the king and he worked for the good of the people. Actually, as I mentioned before, this book is probably better titled Mordecai instead of calling it Esther, because Mordecai really is the principal character in this whole story. And we see how Mordecai goes from where he is actually exalted to the second in command. Similar to the story of Daniel, sort of, how the Lord raised up Daniel. Similar story of Joseph, how God took Joseph from nothingness and brought him to second in the throne. And so actually it's probably better to call this the story of Mordecai instead of the story of Esther. But that's the title of the book, so we work with it. So in summary, if I just wanted to just highlight three things, I think, in this last couple of chapters that I think are important for us in a practical sense on what we can do with some of these lessons. And the first one is, what is our attitude towards those who don't know Jesus? Right? And I'm taking this from this idea of Esther actually pleading with the king. In chapter 8 and verse 3, it says, Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. It's interesting because as we saw in part 2, we saw this struggle between good and evil. We saw this struggle between the Amalekites and Israel. And in a very similar way, what we have to realize is that the enemy is out in the world today to stop people from coming to know Christ. There's a very real spiritual battle that's going on in the world today that's preventing people from coming to know Christ. The Bible says that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. It's up to us to have a burden for them, just like Queen Esther, to weep, to cry, to fast, to pray, to preach, to teach, to witness, to bring somebody to Alpha, which will, Lord willing, be starting in next year. Like, what is our burden for those that don't know? Queen Esther, with a burden for her own people because they were going to be destroyed, wept and cried and begged and pleaded and put her own life on the line for her people. How about us? Do we realize that there are so many hundreds, thousands, even millions of people going into a Christless eternity? And do we have the burden upon our heart to share that good news with other people, the hope that we have in Christ, the joy that the Lord brings to us because of the salvation we have experienced in Him? Do we have that same burden to go and share with others? Look what Paul says in Romans chapter 9 and verse 2 and 3. He says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Here Paul is saying, if it was possible that I could be cut off just so that the people of Israel could be saved, I'd rather have that. Like, I don't know if I could pray like that, like how Paul prayed. I would be like, Lord, thank you for saving me, but save those people as well too. But Paul here says, look, if I could be cut off just so that Israel could be saved, I'll take that. Do we have such a burden? Are we willing to put our life on the line? Esther was willing to put her life on the line. Esther was willing to die to approach the king and plead for the lives of her people. How about for us? Paul's burden was for his own people, that they would see, because they could not see the reality of Christ, that he was the Messiah. Do we have such a burden for our friends, our families, our loved ones, our co-workers, our neighbors, those whom we come in contact with? You know, the story of Moses was very similar in Exodus chapter 32 when God wanted to wipe the children of Israel off and destroy them because of their rebellion. And Moses interceded for the people, and he said in chapter 32, he said, so Moses went back to the Lord and said, oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now please, Lord, forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. See, the intercession of Moses was saying, Lord, please forgive these people. And if you won't, then just blot my name out as well. See the burden that he had for his people. Do we carry such a burden as well? I think one thing that we can see in this story of Esther was the burden that Esther and Mordecai had for their own people. And if we are the true Jews, if we are the true circumcision which worship God in spirit and in truth, should we not have a burden for others that they also would be saved? Esther was, after approaching the king, Esther was in a comfortable place. Now Haman was killed, Mordecai was exalted, her life was safe with the king. She could have just sat back and said, everything is good with me. But no, she wasn't content. She wasn't satisfied. Do we weep at the feet of our King for those who are missing out on the blessings of Calvary? Do we weep and cry at the feet of Jesus so that others might experience what we have tasted of Jesus? That's a challenge for my life, and I hope it's a challenge for you as well today. Probably, I think this was about last year, there was one lady and she had attended a missions conference, and in that missions conference she was really challenged to share the gospel with people in her community. And so she actually thought about her neighbor who was quite elderly, and after attending this missions conference she thought to herself, I'm going to go and share the gospel with this lady, with this neighbor of mine. But life was so busy, as it is with all of us, and things got put off and put off and put off. I was like, I'm going to go and do it. No, put off. And then she got a call on Christmas Day to say that her neighbor died. And she was so sad, and it hit her very emotionally. And she realized that she missed an opportunity to share the gospel with someone. God had put her, this older lady, on her heart to share the gospel, but she didn't obey. She didn't, and it wasn't for out of rebellion or anything. It's just life got busy. This happened and that happened and this happened and that happened. Just didn't get around to actually, spending time to speak with her. And then she died. Dear people of God, dear friends, what is our burden for those that don't know the Lord, that haven't tasted what we have experienced and tasted of the saving grace of Jesus and the sweetness of knowing Christ? So let's not waste time. Let's use this opportunity, especially coming into the Christmas season. As Pastor Roger said, good opportunity to invite someone to church, good opportunity to share the love of God, good opportunity. Sometimes people don't come to church only in Christmas time or Easter time, right? So it's an excellent opportunity for us to be able to witness and share the love of God with others. Number two, the second thing, just three things I want to highlight this afternoon. But the second thing is celebrate the goodness of God. The Feast of Purim was celebrated in order that the Jewish people would remember God's deliverance. When this edict was given to protect the Jews, and it was a celebration. In Esther chapter 8 and verses 15 to 17, it says, "And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating." Sometimes in our lives, when we look at other people that are Christians and we think, man, that Christian life must be really sad, right? We don't see any joy. We don't see anything to celebrate. We don't see anything that we could share with others, and they think, oh, well, if that's the Christian life, I don't want to have any part with it. But that's not what God has called us for. God has called us to remember the goodness of God. And regardless of what trials or difficulties that we're going through, there's always something to rejoice about. There's always something to celebrate. There's always something to give thanks to the Lord for. And I think this Feast of Purim was established and is a reminder for us that we need to continually give thanks. Esther chapter 9 and verse 21 and 22 says, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. I don't know, sounds a lot like Christmas to me, right? I don't know about you, but usually during Christmas time, it's eating, and then some more eating, and then some more eating. And then in between, there's some gifts in between there as well, and then there's some more eating as well. But it's a time of just remembering God's goodness. And I just want to encourage you as well in these days, remember the goodness of God. It's so vital, it is so important for us to think about the goodness of God and give thanks. He has blessed us in so many different ways. He's delivered us in so many different ways, in so many different fashions, and probably in ways that we don't even remember or know. right? And God wants us to give thanks. It's similar to the Feast of Passover. If you remember the Feast of Passover, when God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, what did he tell Israel? He says, make sure you celebrate the Feast of Passover every single year so that you can remember how you were in bondage in Egypt and how God with a mighty hand brought you out of the land of Egypt. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 17, it says, celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. So both the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Purim were celebrated every year to remember God's goodness. I wonder, what do we celebrate every year? We celebrate birthdays, right? Every year. We celebrate anniversaries, celebrate Christmas, Easter. Sometimes there's days in the year that bring us sadness. Maybe a day that we lost a loved one, or there was a tragedy that took place. But do we take time to celebrate with God for what he has done? Are there days in the year that we take apart to celebrate God's goodness? And maybe if we don't, maybe it's something that we should. I mean, the government gives us Thanksgiving and a day off to thank God and praise God, so at least we can take advantage of that day in the year. But maybe we need to write it out in a book. Maybe we need to read it every single year. Maybe parents, you have to write out certain things that happened in your life, dates that are significant, trials that God delivered you from, situations that God saved you from. Maybe you need to write it out in a book and read it to your children. Maybe to rehearse before them, this was the day that God saved us. This was the day that God helped us. This was a time that we were in great trouble and God delivered us and God brought us out of bondage. Maybe we should write out those things and remember it and rehearse it in front of our children so that they will remember as well to give thanks to the Lord. I think it's a beautiful lesson that we learn here in the book of Esther, how this Feast of Purim was established to remember God's goodness. You know, in Joshua chapter 3 and 4, we read about how the children of Israel crossed over into the Jordan River and came into the promised land. But do you remember what God told Joshua to do? Or Joshua told the 12 men to go and gather stones from the Jordan River, and they were to take those stones and they were to set it up in the promised land as a remembrance, so that when they would look back and see those stones, and when their children would ask them, what do these stones mean? The answer would be, these stones represent the day that God parted the Jordan River for us, or stopped the Jordan River for us, and we walked through on dry ground, and God brought us into the promised land. It was a very significant day. I wonder how many of us in our families have days like that written out in a book or in remembrance, or yearly we remember this happened on such and such a day, and we praise God and we thank God and we rejoice in what God has done. What are the pillars in our lives that are pillars of remembrance? And if there aren't any, I want to encourage you before the end of this year, write it out. Look back. Remember God's goodness. Celebrate the Feast of Purim in your life by writing some things out. And remember, this is the day that the Lord saved me. This is the day that I took water baptism. This is the day that I was in a great trouble and God sent his word and healed me. This was a day that this happened in my life and I celebrated. I remember it year after year. We do that for birthdays. We do that for anniversaries. We do that for this thing and that thing and other. Let's remember God's goodness. And if we're diligent and if we're intentional to do that, it helps us to have a heart of rejoicing. It helps us to thank the Lord. It helps us to remember what God was doing. You know, one of the most famous Bible stories is the story of David and Goliath, and how God gave David great deliverance, and how David threw the stone and hit Goliath, and he fell down, and then David came and took the sword of Goliath, and he cut off Goliath's head. You know, some time later, it's interesting because the Bible says that sword was kept with Ahimelech, the priest. And sometime later, when Saul was trying to kill David, this was probably a very low time in David's life. And David actually had to flee the palace where he was, where King Saul was, because he knew Saul was after him and Saul was ready to kill him. And David is fleeing. And when he's fleeing and he's running away, he comes to meet this priest. And he asks the priest, he asks the priest, and he says, it's a request that David makes, and he says to the priest, do you have any swords here that I could use? Because my business is very urgent, and I wasn't able to bring any armor with me. And do you know what the priest says? He says, the only thing I have here is, what? The sword of Goliath. Let me tell you, because this happens in this book of Esther, and it's in this story as well. This is not a coincidence. That the only sword he has available is the sword of Goliath. I think the Lord allowed that to happen. Why? To remind David in this very low time in his life, when Saul the king is after him to kill him, and David has to flee from that place, to leave his best friend Jonathan behind, to leave the palace, to leave everything that he has there, and he's running for his life. And as he's running away, the thing that he encounters is the sword of Goliath, to remind David, hey David, do you remember how I delivered you this time way back when you were just a shepherd boy, and I gave you great deliverance over this big giant Goliath, and it was me that helped you out at that time, and you took that sword and you cut off his head. David, here's the sword again. And remember, David, the same God that helped you way back when is the same God that's going to help you right now in this very low time of life. It was a remembrance. It probably triggered a big memory in David's mind. We don't know what was going on through David's life. Maybe he was just soaring and thinking, why did I get here to the palace? Why is Saul after me? Why is this going to happen? I'm going to end up dying here. And then he comes into contact with Goliath's sword. And he remembers this amazing story of when I was a shepherd boy, God delivered a giant into my hand. So what is there that's too hard for the Lord? Can we look back in our lives and remember how God has delivered us, how God has helped us? I don't know what the problem you're facing today. I don't know the trial that you're facing today. I don't know the sickness you're facing today. I don't know what you're facing today. But can we look back and think of how God has healed us in the past? Can we look back and praise God for how He's delivered us in the past, how He's provided for us, how He's changed us, how He's done so many good things for us? Can we look back and remember those swords of Goliath in our lives and thank the Lord that, God, you are the same yesterday, today, and forever. The same God that delivered me back then is the same God that's going to deliver me today. The same God that healed me back then is the same God that's going to heal me today. The same God that saved me back then, He's going to save me today. The same God that provided for me back then, He's going to provide for me today. And that's what the Feast of Purim is all about. It's a day of celebration. It's a day of joy. It was to remember for the Jewish people at that time how God delivered us. It was a day of condemnation. It was a day of destruction when we were supposed to lose our lives, when there was supposed to be a genocide all throughout the whole Persian Empire, when all the Jews were to be slaughtered and killed, and how God took that situation and turned it completely around for good, and how God delivered and saved them. That's the thing that we need to remember and rejoice in that as well. The third thing, which I think is probably one of the most significant things, is see the fingerprints of the unseen God in your life. And I'll close with this point. See the fingerprints of the unseen God in your life. As we come to the end of this book, we haven't seen once the name of God mentioned in this book. But we've seen Him working. And we see His fingerprints everywhere. In chapter 2, we see Mordecai uncovering a plot to kill the king. But that act of justice goes unrewarded. He could have murmured and complained at that time. He could have said, oh, why is this so unjust? No, but God was working. God was doing His thing. When the lot was cast to decide what month to kill all the Jews, it fell 12 months away, giving time for Mordecai and Esther to act. Esther was bold and courageous to intercede for her people. Esther was patient, not rushing in to tell the king her petition, whether that was to take 3 days of fasting in order to seek the Lord, or whether it was to invite him 2 different times. Esther was patient. If she had asked right away, we don't know what the outcome would have been. It could have been a totally different outcome. You know the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, how Joseph interpreted the dream of the butler and the baker, and he told who was the one that was saved? He told the butler, right? When you're saved, then remember me. And what happened? The dream came to pass, and the butler, did he remember Joseph? No. And maybe Joseph was pulling his hair out in prison and thinking, butler, why didn't you remember me? I helped you out. You were supposed to have remembered me. But think about it. If the butler remembered Joseph, and Joseph was taken out of prison at that time, when Pharaoh had a dream that he needed interpreted, who knows where Joseph would have been? He could have been in this place, that place, far away. He would not have been in the right place at the right time. But when Pharaoh had that dream years later, Joseph was in the right place at the right time. And the butler then remembered at the right time. Oh, I know this guy in prison. He interpreted a dream for me. You should get him out. He'll tell you what's going on. And he came out, interpreted the dream. He went from the pit to the palace in one day. See, God doesn't make mistakes. And there are no coincidences with the Lord. And we might think, oh, where's God? He's not moving. He's not here. But it's the fingerprints of the unseen God seen in all of these stories, right? Joseph said in Genesis 50, it's a very familiar verse, you intended, speaking to his brothers, he said, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, to save many lives, right? That sleepless night that the king had, out of everything he could ask for to be read, it was the book of the Acts that took place in the kingdom. And out of all the things that could be read, it was the exact portion of Mordecai's good deed, right? And then Mordecai is honored. Even that, Mordecai being honored and being toured around the whole palace, that was so that people would be able to come to know who Mordecai is. Because later on, when Mordecai is sending out this edict, when Mordecai is trying to put a stop to all the things, they're going to be wondering, who is this guy Mordecai that's issuing all of these things in the king's name? But no, now everybody knew who Mordecai was because he was paraded around the palace. He was paraded around and said, this is whom the king delights to honor. And even that, God was preparing the way for Mordecai to take up his position, right? The king takes Esther's side instead of Haman's side. It could have totally gone the other way. Because remember in chapter 1, the king gets upset at Queen Vashti and he says, forget it, you're out of here, right? And it could have very well gone the opposite way for Queen Esther when she went and approached the king. But it was God's favor. It was God's hand working in all of these things. And when they didn't know what to do, the king gave them an idea of writing an edict, right? And even when the king goes back to Esther and asks, is there anything else that you would like done? We see Mordecai being exalted, and that's good news for the Jewish people. And Purim was established to celebrate what God has done. Dear people of God, dear friends, there's so many things that go on in our lives. And it might not be some miraculous parting of the Red Sea. It might not be some miraculous dead rising again. It might not be something miraculous like fire coming down from heaven to be able to say, that's God. No. It's through the mundane, through the regular things that God's hand is seen in our lives. Proverbs 16 and verse 33, I like this verse. It says, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. What it means is that it might seem like just random things are happening. No. It is God that is giving every decision. And so we rest in His sovereignty. We rest in His providence. We rest in His goodness. And we rest in His love for us. We see God working through regular people and regular circumstances to accomplish His purposes. We may not see the miracles, the signs, the wonders, and He can do that, definitely. And we see that in other books in the Bible. We don't see that in this book, but we do see that miraculous in other books. But He's still working. He's working through the mundane, through the ordinary, through the regular things in our lives. Nothing is a coincidence with God. It's just His timing that is perfect. It is God speaking in silence. God speaking in the silence. Can we see that? There's so many great reversals in this book. And it's amazing to see that because it speaks to us about how God can reverse the course of our lives as well. Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 11 says, He has made everything beautiful in His time, a very familiar verse. But what does the rest of it say? He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. You know, the interesting thing about this story in the book of Esther is that we know the end of the story, right? We can read this whole thing and we can look back and rejoice and think, oh, wow, amazing how God worked. Look at how God delivered Esther and Mordecai and all the Jewish people. What a wonderful story. And then we look at our lives and we think, oh, Lord, what's happening to me? It's because we don't know the end of our story. And sometimes here, I have a picture here. Sometimes our lives look a little bit like that, right? Yeah, it looks like a big mess, right? All these yards and strings here and there. And maybe we're thinking about our life like this. If you asked Esther in that time when she first heard the edict and said, Esther, how are things going? She'll probably be saying, oh, I don't know what's going on. And there are times in our lives when we go through hard times and we go through difficulties and our life looks a little bit like this. It's all a mess. But you know what this really is? This is the backside of a crown. So that's the front. That's the back. The problem is, we're looking at our lives right here, but this is what God is looking at in eternity. We're looking and seeing all the messes and all the trials and all the problems and all the difficulties here. But see, God sees the bigger picture. God sees what He's weaving. God sees what He's doing. It's like the book of Esther. We get to see now from the end, we get to see everything that happened. But our problem is we're just living in the present, and so we're seeing this. But God is seeing that. Can we trust in the sovereign God? Can we trust that the Lord is working in our lives? Right? What would happen if you could read your story? See, you only know the beginning of the story, and you only know the middle of your story. You don't know the end of your story. We know the beginning of Esther's story. We know the middle of Esther's story. We know the end of Esther's story. And we can read it and we can be like, wow, God, you're so amazing. Lord, can you do that for me? That's such an amazing God. That's the God I want to serve. Look at what He did for Esther. Look how He provided and delivered and saved and did so many amazing things. God, I want you to do that for me. Well, spoiler alert, He is doing that for us. We just haven't seen the end yet. We just haven't seen the way that God sees. And we keep looking at this like this, and we keep pulling our hair out and thinking, Lord, what's going on? But God is saying, I'm working. I'm weaving. I'm doing my work. Hold on. Just wait a little bit longer. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to flip it over. You're going to see when you get to heaven, the other side. Doesn't that excite you? Yeah, you're still looking at this side over here. You're thinking, oh, no. But if God were to give us a glimpse of the crown, if God were to give us a glimpse of eternity, if God were to give us a glimpse of what He's actually doing, we'd be like, yeah. I think when we get to heaven, we might be like, oh, Lord, if I'd only suffered a little bit more. If I'd only had some more trials. Yeah, I know, now you're thinking, no way. But when we get to eternity, maybe we'll be like, well, Lord, if you could have done something even more beautiful, if I'd gone through those trials and those difficulties. Dear people of God, dear friends, God is working in our lives. I'll close with this verse, Romans 15 and verse 4. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us. That's why we're studying the book of Esther. So that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. We see the end of the story of Esther. We don't see the end of the story of our lives. But God is still working. The same way He worked in Esther's life, same way He worked in Mordecai's life, He is working in our lives because He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Keep your eyes on the crown. Keep your eyes on this beautiful tapestry that He's weaving. It's called your life. And He's going to flip it over one day, and then you're going to be like, oh, that's why He allowed it. Oh, that's what He was doing. Finally, I see. I shouldn't have been murmuring and complaining all that time. But we will see one day, and we'll rejoice with Him for all eternity. God bless you.